We'd like to welcome you to our online series of archaeology workshops coming to you from the State Museum of Pennsylvania, and happy Archaeology Month. I'm Beth Hager, I'm the director of the museum. Currently the museum is closed and we're really sorry that we can't have you in person this year, but we're so pleased that you've joined us for this series of special presentations. I'd like to thank our archaeology staff for their work and flexibility in making this series happen online, and our speakers over the next few weeks and their great contributions, our presenting partner, the Pennsylvania Heritage Foundation, and a big shout out to our education and exhibits departments for producing the series and doing all of the special behind the scenes work to make sure it gets online. I'd like to now introduce a member of the education department, Sherry Trimble. She's a museum educator who's coordinating the series and will be giving you some special information about viewing the series today. Sherry, I turn it over to you.
Welcome. I want to welcome everybody, like Beth said, to the 2020 Archaeology Workshop. We are wanting to thank the Pennsylvania Heritage Foundation for all their support for programs such as this workshop. I know some of you have already supported the foundation with your donations. And this particular year, the Archaeology Workshop will be exploring the Delaware Indians then and now. This is a 4-part series. So today we're going to be meeting with Roger Moeller. Later on next week, we're going to be meeting with Gregory. He is going to be talking about the contact period in New Jersey. Then we're going to be moving October 16th in with Jean Sutherland, and she's going to be talking about the Delaware Valley 1624 to 1700. And then, wrapping everything up with Dr. Bryce Oberman. We're going to talk about where they are now and what's this culture up to. So, but today we're going to be hooking up with Dr. Moeller via video. It's going to be a little different, but we're also going to have question and answer that will be live. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kurt Carr. His anthropological studies began when he received his BA from Franklin and Marshall College in 1971. In 1975, he obtained his MA from Catholic University and continued at Catholic to get his PhD in 1992. Dr. Carr has had many roles at the PHMC. In 1980, he started at the State Museum. In 1985, he moved over to the State Historic Preservation Office to finally return in 2007 to the State Museum of Pennsylvania to serve as the Senior Curator of Archaeology. He supervises and manages over 10 million artifacts. Our collection's huge. He concentrates his studies in the changing culture adaptations among Native American cultures in the Mid-Atlantic region. I have had the great pleasure to work with Dr. Carr since 1996. I'm dating us, I know. And he's always been a great resource and colleague.
Okay, thank you, Sherry and Beth. Today's presentation is by Dr. Roger Moeller. He will summarize the pre-European contact archaeology of the Upper Delaware Valley, essentially the region north of East Stroudsburg and the Delaware Water Gap. And it will provide a background on the ancestor to the Delaware people, covering about 12,000 years of their history. The Upper Delaware is one of the more intensively studied regions of the Delaware Valley and serves as a model or a case study of cultural development for the rest of the region. Although Dr. Moeller's presentation will focus on the Pennsylvania side of the river, archaeological studies began on both sides of the river in the Upper Delaware in the late 1800s by the University of Pennsylvania. Later, Max Schrabisch between 1915 and 1930, and Vernon Leslie and Dorothy Cross in the 1940s continued to conduct significant research projects in the Delaware Valley. However, the major research effort was sponsored by the National Park Service in association with the Tox Island Dam project in the Upper Delaware. This was in the 1960s. Dr. W. Fred Kinsey was the principal investigator, and he published a significant synthesis on the archaeology of both sides of the river in 1972 that still stands today as a major reference for the Delaware Valley and the Middle Atlantic region as a whole. Dr. Moeller's presentation, or simply Roger, since I've known him for over 50 years, that's really a long time. Every time I say that, it's amazing. But he will take a chronological approach to summarizing the major archaeological time periods, beginning with the Paleoindian period at over 12,000 years ago, followed by the Archaic period, the Transitional period, and the Woodland period, ending about 500 years ago. For the Paleoindian period, he will focus on the work by American University and later Temple University at the Shawnee menacing Paleoindian site. For the rest of the presentation, he will focus on Dr. Kinsey's work, who excavated 11 sites over a period of 7 years between 1965 and 1972. Most of these were stratified. That is, the artifacts were deeply buried in layers of cultural occupations, allowing for the detailed examination of how cultures changed over thousands of years. This is actually a relatively rare archaeological context, and there are so many of these in the upper Delaware. Roger served as Kinsey's crew chief for most of this time period, and in the early 1970s, he completed both his master's thesis and his doctoral dissertation on these sites. Since that time, Roger has conducted groundbreaking research on the function of pit features. These are holes that were dug by Native Americans, and the upper Delaware is famous for its numerous so-called hearths, storage, or trash pits. In my excavations up there, you could hardly dig a 10-foot square without finding one of these. However, the function has always been a mystery. Roger's analysis of these features, which he will discuss in his presentation, was a major contribution to their understanding. He also has a reinterpretation of the dating of pottery that he'll discuss, late woodland pottery. I must admit that this presentation is a trip down memory lane for me. My first field school was with Dr. Kinsey in 1965, and Roger was my crew chief in 1966 and 1967. The 5 summers I spent in the upper Delaware was an incredible learning experience for me that I remember fondly. Since that time, I've excavated many different types of sites in the Mid-Atlantic region. In my opinion, the stratified sites in the upper Delaware Valley offer one of the most productive scientific laboratories anywhere in the Northeast for the investigation of changing Native American cultural adaptations over the past 5,000 years. It's an incredible place. Now we can start Roger's presentation, and I hope you will be impressed with the archaeology of the upper Delaware Valley.
I will present the Paleoindian, Archaic, Transitional, and Woodland periods at specific sites with their artifacts, excavation, and analytical techniques and major findings. Since most of the excavations took place in the 1960s and 1970s, there have been major advances in technology and research from adjacent areas. This has changed and enhanced our interpretations of these sites and their time periods. The upper Delaware Valley is an extensively wooded environmental funnel. Steep shale banks descend to a narrow floodplain on the Pennsylvania side from Milford to Bushkill. In the 1960s, a dam was planned at Tox Island, north of the water gap, to create a 60-kilometer-long reservoir for a water supply, flood control, and tourist activities extending north to Port Jervis, New York. Although the dam is no longer planned, park facilities and tourism uses continue to impact the cultural resources. Surface collecting and deep testing on the floodplain pinpointed locations of sites worthy of large-scale excavations. The initial surveys identified more than 100 archaeological sites in the Upper Valley. As the research continues and is supplemented from adjacent areas and disciplines, the questions become more complex. As the technology increases, we can ask questions not thought possible previously. Paleoindian sites across the state are as early as 16,000 years ago at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. The Marshalls Creek Mastodon was found 4 kilometers from the Shawnee menacing site. The presumed date of 12,000 years ago is in the range of human occupation for the state, but no direct associations have been found between Paleoindians and megafauna hunting in Pennsylvania. In 1972, Don Klein, an amateur archaeologist, found the Shawnee menacing site close to the water gap. He showed Russ Hansman and I a thumbnail scraper from a very deep test pit he had dug. His 3-meter deep test at the stratified site was later expanded into a major excavation. An actual buried Paleoindian site disproved common knowledge. They were not living in a glacial environment. They were not primarily big game hunters. They are not nomadic, following large herds. All sites were not hunting related. The mastodon date is 1,000 years before the Shawnee menacing occupation. Many tons of soil were shoveled, troweled, and sifted before an actual fluted point was found. Artifacts include 2 fluted points, bifaces, debitage, end scrapers, side scrapers, and utilized flakes made of chert. Most of the chert was local, from an outcrop a mile from the site. Scrapers were used for cleaning and processing hides. Tool use was determined by photomicrographs and edge wear analysis. Carbonized grape, plum, and hackberry seeds from a hearth and hickory nuts from elsewhere contradict the big game hunting model. These plants also suggest a mosaic environment, deciduous trees in some locales and evergreens in others. A glacier would not have been visible from this camp. It had melted at least a millennia earlier. Population density increased during the late Archaic. Groups of related families established base camps, from which they moved less frequently than in earlier periods. Climate is similar to today's. Standard excavation techniques included large blocks being opened by bulldozing the plow zone. Any artifacts there would have been removed from their original contexts. 10 by 10 foot grids were laid in with a transit. Corners were marked with stakes. Later, masonite squares with a shingle nail were used as being more efficient to mark the corners. Flat shoveling cleared the bulldozer treads in loose soil. A clear view of the subsoil surface revealed pits and post molds. I consider most of the artifacts to be generic, functional objects from locally available materials. Net sinkers, pestles, grinding slabs, mullers, hammerstones, and choppers. These recur at transitional and woodland sites. A few others, gorgets, spear thrower weights, banner stones, are far less frequently found, but also have a long time span. The projectile points, spearheads, or knives are more typologically useful for dating, but the variation can be significant at a single location. Archaic components are where you find them. We dug a lot of deep trenches and sometimes found features or artifact concentrations. Unless there is a great concentration of charcoal, all of the other organics and evidence of ground disturbance decayed long ago. A hearth filled with charred butternut shells was nearly 10 feet below the original ground surface. Features are found by clustering of artifacts rather than by the staining around them. Hearths with fire-cracked rocks are the most common. The longer they were used, the more fragmented the rocks. Cats are rare. Net sinkers in process from the faucet site include cobbles collected from the river bank. Most of these features were dug before the use of flotation. There's almost no floral or faunal evidence. This was also before charcoal identification to determine the trees being burned. Transitional period. There is some evidence for a change in climate in the form of the warm and dry subboreal climatic episode. This could have brought people closer to the river. Broadhead, Heller, Peters, Albrecht, and the faucet sites had large, deeply buried, sometimes 3 to 6 feet deep features. The depth of the components varied from site to site. Not all sites had every time period. Flooding pattern varied even between very close sites. At this site, the fragments were removed and the fill was sifted. Seems like a waste. We asked how and why were these hearths used. One theory was that the hearths were created under wooden racks for drying fish. They were raked into a pile to be heated and then spread under the rack. With long-term use of heating and raking, the rock shattered and fragmented. Another theory was for hot rock boiling for stew and hide or stone containers. Now we need to find more to test these ideas. A long hearth was being exposed in profile and at the surface. Nothing special found in between the fragments. No flotation was done. About a ton of fill between the fragments was flotated. Only charcoal was found. A large section of this hearth was mapped fire-cracked rock fragment by fire-cracked rock fragment, with each piece numbered. The numbers were written onto the pieces and onto the map. Attempts were made to fit the pieces to determine how far they were scattered. Minimal scatter, reheated in place. Great scatter, raked, reheated, and repeat. No pattern was found because not many fits were found. At the Broadhead Heller site, multiple hearths were found from different components at closely spaced stratified layers. Very intense reoccupation and reuse of the same place for the same purpose. Net sinkers are found at these sites, suggesting intensive fishing. Steatite bowl or steatite fragments are commonly found. Broad-bladed spear points or knives, as well as long, slender orient fishtail points. The Broadhead Heller points and knives in stratigraphic sequence. Late Woodland period marks the beginning of more sedentary lifestyles. Intensive hunting and gathering of wild plants and animals, the use of domesticated plant foods, and the widespread use of improved pottery. The faucet site will be used to illustrate every late woodland component. Aerial view of faucet site during one of 3 seasons of excavation. Over 100 pit features found in 1972 were used for cooking, food protection, human burials, and refuse disposal. Patterning of hundreds of post moles found on the subsoil surface was recognized only by using a computer program. A middle woodland roundhouse and a side of a longhouse were found at the same level. Some late woodland pits were subsequently dug into the middle woodland house pattern. A deer mandible was found in one feature. Pits were vertically cross-sectioned. Flotation samples were taken by the natural levels, or lacking these, by arbitrary 6-inch units. This pit was used to steam river mussels open. The halves were twisted apart and the meat removed. The shells were then disposed of into the empty pit. Stacked turtle shell cups and large pottery sherds were in another feature. Fire-cracked rock was in the bottom of a shallow pit. Note that the size of the hearths drastically decreases during this time period compared to the transitional period. Troweling, sifting, and flotation of many pits 3 feet in diameter and 4 feet deep yielded only bits of charcoal. Why dig huge pits and leave them empty to fill naturally? Storage is the wrong word. They were used for short-term protection of processed food. Plants and animals from many locations were processed for winter consumption. Gutting, skinning, shucking, cracking, cooking, steaming, boiling, and drying creates a lot of garbage. Open disposal would attract bears, raccoons, dogs, skunks, and other scavengers. The garbage in the pits was covered with dirt daily. Flotation samples were taken from half of every feature by natural or arbitrary levels. Each bucket held 25 pounds, or approximately 1/4 of a cubic foot of soil. More than 15 tons of feature fill was flotated through a window screen into the river. The tub was placed on concrete blocks on the river. The current swirled under the screen in the bottom of the tub, washing away the majority of the soil. A tea strainer scooped the light fraction. Whatever remained was carried forward onto drying pans. The flotation results. All samples were dried, sorted, identified, analyzed, cataloged, and interpreted. We now know at least some of their diet. listing of plants and recognized animals. Lavanna and Madison triangular points were quite common. A Munsey pot with castellations and effigy face. A Bainbridge linear variant corded pot. It's very interesting that the variety of motifs found at this small site. The Archaeology of New York State shows that these different motifs were in use over approximately 500 years. And we assumed that since our motifs were so similar to theirs, that the dates would be the same. By 2003, advanced dating showed that these pottery vessels actually varied quite significantly. In this feature map, the location of the pit features indicated by different colors show refitting pottery sherds and clay smoking pipes. The refitted sherds found in pits of each color were all deposited during the same occupation. They're all contemporaneous with each other. Fits from one pit had different fragments that could be fitted to other fragments in other pits. Contemporaneous design elements and motifs are the castellations and sizing, cording, cord wrap, stick impressions, fingernail impression, punctates, human effigy faces, triangles, slanted lines, parallelograms, trapezoids, chevrons, and notches. High and low collars are also contemporaneous. Acknowledgements. I'd like to thank these people very much. There are also individual credits on photos. These were some of the books that were used in the interpretation. There's thousands of pages written about these topics. Thank you very much.
All right, so we appreciate Dr. Moeller. I know this was a video presentation, but it was great that he was able to take the time to pre-record this session. Kurt, I've watched this video a couple of times now, and the flotation results, I have found this fascinating after I watched this a couple of times. Did you know anything about that and how they found the different materials through that flotation results?
I'm not sure what you mean by that, but
So,
I mean, the flotation process, they would take soil from these pit features. So we know it comes from certain time periods and certain activities. We know their locations. And they would put it through essentially a window screen in the water, in the river. And we do similar things now. We usually don't put it in a river. We use pure water, if you will, cleaner water. But then the light material floats to the top while that big tone you saw, that floats to the top, and you skim it off and then dry it, and then you identify all those different seeds and plant parts. And so, yeah, he had a long list of different types of plants that were identified in these pit features from the late Woodland period. And of course, maize was part of that. I noticed that, I don't know that I've ever noticed this before, but beans and squash, which are so frequently found at other late Woodland sites, they seem to be absent. Well, they were absent from that list, so I'm not sure why they weren't found. But actually, the Delaware Valley seems to have corn, not particularly early, but once it's here by 1400, it's pretty common throughout the Delaware Valley. And you wonder why these other corns or beans and squash weren't identified. Did that answer your question, or?
Yeah, somebody asked me the results. Now, unfortunately, I've got the sound recording, but let me share my screen.
That's the list of the plants and the animals that were found in flotation. I assume, though, that some of those, the animal bones, and for that matter, charred plant remains, may have actually been excavated. They might have been large enough that they were picked out before you actually had to go through the flotation process.
Mm. Yeah, I found that. This I think was probably the most interesting slide too.
Oh.
Mm.
But it really is important. His work was really significant because up to that time, nobody had done extensive amounts of flotation. They had been very selective about it, but in his case, he looked at every feature. Usually people would only float features where you could sort of get some indication that there were lots of remains. Actually, in 1965 with Barry Kent, he floated a feature, but it was a feature that was full of charred beans. In fact, it was beans. So there was an example that beans were found. I don't know why Roger didn't find them, but and we just used a screen and poured water through it with material. But that was the only time that we did flotation up until Roger started in the early 70s. So when you do it on that scale, you get a much better representative sample of what actually was going on. And there were lots of other excavations that were being conducted in the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast that didn't do that. So Roger really did something new and different. And he also inspired other people to start doing it flotation in a systematic manner.
There's a couple of questions about the pits and their depth and things like that. And I've been reading myself a couple of things about the pits. So what do you think what in theory almost looks like an empty storage pit, but really truly when you start examining it, the things you're finding and their usage of storage pits?
He doesn't think that they were being used. They were being used for temporary storage. They would process foods, boil them, for example, or just process them in some way and store them in pits until the fall, for example, when they moved off the floodplain. His idea, so he has some assumptions built into this, but in all the excavating that we did up there and that he did later on after I quit, and I was just a field tech, but I think only 3 houses were found in all that excavations. And it's very different from the Susquehanna Valley or the Ohio Valley and valleys all over eastern United States where you find large villages. And the Delaware Valley, you don't seem to find them. Certainly there's nothing like the Susquehannocks and Shank Ferry or Monongahela villages. And so he thinks that the sites that we actually excavated on the floodplain were processing sites and collecting sites. And then once the foods, whatever that was collected, they would take it someplace else to consume. And he thought they were mostly collecting in the late summer and fall, and then moving into the uplands. Although the Park Service conducted some upland surveys in the 1990s, and they also didn't find any big villages up there. So we're not sure what's the situation there.
So one of the questions that came up, picking the sites. There are not that many Delaware sites in comparison to some of our other cultures in Pennsylvania. Choosing some of these particular sites or any site of the Delaware?
There are historic contact period sites in the upper Delaware. And of course you would ask me that question and I can't remember what the name of the site is right now. So there is one major site up there, but these are clearly the ancestors of what we call the Delaware culture, the Delaware tribe, if you will. Mm-hmm. And those sites, again, these villages that we can associate directly with the Delaware, those are very rare. But historically, we know, they refer to Delaware towns. So they seem to be living in these clusters. We just haven't found them. And I do think that the Delaware practiced a different settlement pattern, a different living pattern, if you will, seasonal pattern than these other tribes, which were seemingly more dependent on corn and for a variety of reasons, lived in large groups and lived in one spot for years at a time. The Delaware don't seem to have, there's certainly a few examples. There's no question about that. There are examples, but we must have 30 or 40 villages in the Susquehanna Valley. The number of Delaware villages is just very small.
Somebody's asking, so the Muncie community called the Mincing Island was quite a large
Yes,
site?
yes, that is a large site. Yes, yes, that is. Thank you, whoever reminded me of that. And there are other sites in the lower Delaware too, down towards Philadelphia, on the New Jersey side at least. And there's one site in the upper Delaware that was excavated by Herb Kraft, and I think he has several longhouses there, which we would define as a village. But maybe they just didn't live that way.
Mm-hmm.
I see a question from Sue Brazano.
Go for it.
Net sinkers.
Go.
Yes, that was at the faucet site, Sue. And that would only be found, that was after Fred Kinsey's report, as I remember. I wasn't there when that was, well, anyway, that was at the faucet site. And I think that did not make it into Fred's book. And the Park Service has that collection.
Floodplains and the UDV are relatively narrow. Could it be that villages are simply more linear than clustered houses that we see elsewhere?
I'm just not sure that that's what was going on, because they dug a lot of, and yes, they dug on the stratified floodplain, so the lower terraces, if you will. To my knowledge, we dug maybe one site on an upper terrace, the McCann site. So yes, they might be off these lower terraces, but it's Clemson's Island sites, for example, don't seem to be villages. They seem to be this linear pattern of houses, and that's what you find in the Susquehanna Valley. So I'm not, it needs to be tested. We need to look at these upper terraces more carefully. But yeah, that's still a mystery as to where they're living, or where the villages are, or why don't they have villages. But we can't, my point about Clemson's Island, those are only single or double houses, and we find plenty of those. But many of those have been located, and they are located, on that lower floodplain. And in the upper Delaware, we've examined a lot of floodplain on the lower terraces, and we just, like I said, I think there's only 3 on the Pennsylvania side.
A little bit more about petroglyphs. I know you've studied the petroglyphs in our area. So where have you typically, because he was thinking this may be one of the only ones found in the Upper River Valley, but where have you seen them?
Well, yes, to my knowledge, there is only one in the Delaware. And there's only a couple in the Susquehanna, and they're in the lower Susquehanna. And then there's a bunch in the Allegheny and the Ohio. So there's something different going on in terms of the way people made petroglyphs and used that kind of imagery. One of the explanations that I've often heard is that Algonquian people were the ones who were making petroglyphs. Iroquoian people didn't do that. They carved images on trees. That's maybe a simplistic explanation, but that's the only thing I know about petroglyphs, or in terms of their differential distribution. But there does seem to be a clear pattern, a regional pattern of where you find petroglyphs, and you don't find them in Iroquois, is my understanding, and certainly we don't find many of them in the Delaware Valley.
Someone was asking, has anybody now with the latest technology, ground penetrating radar, LiDAR, and things like that, has anybody started looking in the Delaware Valley for any new sites recently?
Fred Kinsey did his work in preparation for the Tux Island Dam. They never built the dam, but in the meantime, the federal government bought up the property. And so now much of the what we call the upper Delaware, is owned by the federal government, and they're trying to protect those sites. So there have been very few investigations in the upper Delaware on either side of the river. And the only investigations that we have seen are for construction projects. The Marshall's Creek Transportation Project, for example, that was in the uplands, a mile or 2 from the Delaware. They identified a great series of lithic quarries, stone used to make stone tools. So that was a pretty significant thing. But again, nobody's identified a village up there yet.
One of the great things that we still have current people celebrating their Delaware culture. So many people aren't able to do that, but it's great that we're able to still contact with them.
Yes, and Bryce Obermeyer is going to do a great presentation on that at the end of the month. He'll talk about the Delaware, where they are now, how they got there in Oklahoma, and then their plans at the repatriation of Delaware remains to Pennsbury.
Oh, excellent.
Yes. So it's.
I know that they've been working for a couple of years on that project.
Yes, they have, and actually remains from western part of Pennsylvania. Were repatriated in Ohio at Schönbrunn. It's a Moravian site, and I was able to attend that event, and it was really, really spectacular. It was quite the anthropological experience and emotional experience. So anyway.
All right, any last minute questions before we all sign off? And oh, we meant to see. Oh, it's just another mention that the Delaware Drive maintains an office for compliance at East Stroudsburg University.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a question. Any evidence of interaction with the Upper Delaware Valley and the Susquehanna River Valley or the east along the coast, or did groups primarily interact up and down the river? Like, go up and down.
It does seem like there was some up and down movement, but especially in the middle Delaware, it's been suggested that, yes, one of the reasons we don't find these big villages is that they were moving to the coast where there would have been a lot of food resources. So that might be one explanation, is that the interior tribes needed to, increase food production. And so corn was the way they did it. And actually before corn, there were lots of other plant foods that they were exploiting and probably growing. But they never really had to depend on corn like the coastal groups. I'm sorry, the coastal groups didn't have to depend on corn the way the interior groups did, and exploited all those coastal resources. And they think the Delaware might have been in that habit, or in that settlement, using that settlement pattern to exploit the environment. So yes, we think that there was coastal movements from the Delaware to the coast and back and forth. There's actually a very large complex called the Abbott Farm Complex. It's around Trenton, and that was actually the Abbott Farm, the sites, and it's a group of sites. They've been, Dorothy Cross investigated those, and actually, I forgot the guy, but again, in the teens, the 19-teens, they were being investigated, and then Cross conducted a major excavation there in the 40s and 50s, and then there was a highway project in the 80s, and that really, they did an excellent job of sampling a large number of sites, and we learned a lot from that. And yes, one of the conclusions was that they were not the corn growers that we expected them to be. And it is interesting because people have stereotypes of how Indians lived in the past. And, when you start to look at these things in detail, obviously stereotypes are frequently wrong. And that's the fascinating thing about archaeology, that we're looking at the variety of adaptations that people use to exploit the environment. And, right here in Pennsylvania, it's, you have significant differences in the way people were exploiting the environment, just 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. We're starting to see a lot more, well, because we're doing a lot more work, we're starting to see a lot more variation in the way the environment was being exploited.
Speaking of ethnic connections, somebody was asking, has anybody done any studies on looking at ethnic connections of these early woodlands and archaic folks? Like, have they done any blood tracing?
No, we have so few skeletons, if that's what you mean. That certainly in other regions, they've done a lot of DNA analysis, and that's not ethnic, that's just biology. That's all we can really say about that. But in other regions, actually, especially in Europe and Asia, they've done a lot of DNA studies. And again, it really brings a lot of specificity to the movements of people. which is something that actually would be very interesting to do with the Delaware, because a lot of people think that they showed up maybe about 1,500 to 2,000 years ago. They figured it's thought that there was a significant change in the archaeological record, and yeah, don't question me on this, but that I don't know the details of that, but they think there was a significant change, and they think, well, maybe that's when the Delaware showed up. Well, what we are learning from these European studies, for example, is that there was a lot more movement in the past. Archaeologists have always debated whether it was migration or independent invention, how we see these technological changes. And for a long time, it was felt, no, for the most part, people were sitting in one spot and evolving as, changing their adaptation as the environment, both cultural and natural environment, changed. And what we're seeing in those European studies is no, there's a lot more movement going on, and there are groups that are living side by side that we thought were very different. And we, how was that working out? The big story in Europe, for example, is that the hunters and gatherers who were, descendants from the Pleistocene about 5,000 years ago, people from the Near East showed up in Europe. And it was originally thought, based on the archaeology, that these people from the Near East were farmers and they took over. And the local population that had been there for thousands of years moved out, and they disappeared. And now we know that they actually overlapped for several thousand years. And, we're not sure how that actually operated, but yeah, again, as you collect more data, the story gets more complex, but more interesting and probably more realistic.
Someone put in, and this is great, I do want to thank also, we work very closely, Kurt, definitely, with the Society of Pennsylvania Archaeology. So they were just added a link to that chapter. Want to talk a little bit about that group?
The Society of Pennsylvania Archaeology is one of the oldest archaeological societies in the United States, and they have one of the longest records of publication since the 1920s. And that really, for a long time, that was the backbone of archaeological studies in Pennsylvania. And they've worked closely. It's a group of mostly non-professional avocational archaeologists, if you will. These are people who have an intense interest in the past and in artifacts. And they've worked closely, many of them work closely with professional archaeologists, with institutions. The State Museum, yes, we have a close relationship with them, actually all across the state. So it's a very valuable information, a very valuable source of information and assistance, really.
There's a question that popped up a little bit ago, and it's interesting because I know that you and I are going to be talking about this next week when we connect with Greg, but the evidence of burial sites in the Lenape or Susquehannock Indians, any evidence of mound building?
No.
Yeah.
There was, I think there's one mound. That's not true. There's two large mounds in New Jersey, one at the north end of the Delaware and one at the south end. And yes, who are those people? We don't know. They do seem to show relations, at least the one in the northern Delaware seems to show relationship. Rosencrantz Ferry, I think, is the name of that site. They seem to show some relationship with things that are going on in Ohio. So, we don't know that those are Delaware, but, again, it's hard to really evaluate these things that are hundreds or even thousands of years old. In the Susquehanna Valley, the last time we had mounds was Clemson's Island about 1,000 years ago. That was the first farming group. But these mounds were very different than the mounds in Ohio. The Clemson Island mounds seemed to contain everybody and not a lot of artifacts, whereas the mounds in Ohio seemed to be more selective about who was buried in those, and they contained lots of exotic grave goods, grave offerings. So it's a different kind of mound system in the Susquehanna and the Delaware.
There's something about a mention that a mound might have been destroyed at the junction of the Susquehanna and Juniata rivers.
Clark's Ferry. Yep, it was. It was a horrible thing. They talk about carrying wagon loads of remains out of there. So it seemed to have been a very large, and that was a Clemson's Island mound. Again, these mounds are large. They're not as high, if you will, but they seem to have been pretty large and contained, everybody was buried in that. I think both, I'm not sure about children, but all the adults were buried in these things. And they seem to be there, they think they were actually regionally organized, so that all the Clemson's Island sites along the lower Juniata River, they all buried their dead in this mound. And you see them on the west branch of the Susquehanna. Juniata and the west branch of the Susquehanna are the ones that I'm most familiar with, and also, I guess, the main stem of the Susquehanna. Clemson's Island was named the island that's in the Susquehanna just above the mouth of the Juniata at Halifax. Yeah, that was they had a large mound on that island. That whole mound building phenomenon is kind of interesting, and there's different types of behavior that created those mounds.
So what the plan is now is that there are 3 more presentations for the next 3 Fridays, once again at noon. The link that you're using right now is the same link that you will use for all of them. So I don't see any other questions. Thank you, Dr. Carr, so much for joining us today. And we look forward to hopefully seeing everybody next Friday.
Well, yes, thanks to everybody who attended and who had questions. I hope we answered them. And if we didn't, please send us emails and we can try to answer them that way.